Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, The Faith Community's Role in Preventing and Healing Child Sexual Abuse. I'll introduce our presenter in just a few moments, but first we're going to go over some technical details, first of which you should be able to see, as well as see the technical information slide, which didn't show up. You should be able to see the Kathy Reid slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend that you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again. All audience members are muted. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them at any time using the question feature on the right side of your screen, and we would love to hear from you, so submit your questions at any point. If you don't see the question box on your screen, click on the little orange arrow, and that will open up more features that you can use. The slides you see on your screen will be sent to you later this afternoon as a PDF, so you will have them as a resource. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join us. So if you have colleagues or friends who couldn't be part of today's presentation, please let them know the recording will be available. So we're delighted to have Kathy Reid join us today. She is the Executive Director of the Family Abuse Center in Waco, Texas. She serves as Associate General Secretary for the Church of the Brethren and was founding pastor of Austin's Mennonite Church. For 7 years, she was the Executive Director of the Texas Homelessness Network. Kathy is the author of several books, including Preventing Child Sexual Abuse, a religious education curriculum for children ages 5 to 8, and Preventing Child Sexual Abuse, a religious education curriculum for children ages 9 to 12. Kathy has more than 20 years experience training congregations, pastors, and individuals around issues of child protection. So just to remind you, we would love to know what your role is regarding today's issues. So I'm going to put up a little poll here. If you could just let us know what your role is. And Kathy, I am unmuting you. Are you with me?
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah. I'm here.
Okay, so we're just going to give this poll another couple seconds, and then I will kind of give you a sense of who's joining us today. Okay, here we go, closing the poll and sharing the results. So can you see that, Kathy?
Yeah, it looks like we got lots of advocates and social workers.
Your people.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, they're all my people. I fit into all those categories, so that's great. That's really helpful. So I am thrilled to be here, and this topic that we're talking about today is near and dear to my heart because it is literally one of the topics that I think I most often do training on, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with people around the nice thing about webinars is you can be from around the world. Sarah, I don't see the PowerPoint. Oh, there it is. Okay. And are you going to transfer that over to me now?
I believe I have.
Okay, let me see.
Maybe, maybe not. Okay. No. Okay. We're having some technical issues, folks.
Well, if you want to go ahead and click, you can. I mean, we'll just leave it with you, and let's carry on so we don't have. I think that part of the reason, I want to start off by just saying that part of the reason that this topic I think is so critically important is that I did my original training back in the 80s, a long time ago. I feel old. And at the time, I was the director of Christian education in a United Methodist Church, actually, in Northern California, and we had lots of kids, lots and lots of kids, to the point where we had about 75 kids that would come forward for the children's story. And I personally came from a very, what I would call healthy Mennonite family with lots of extended family around and lots of support and care. And so when I started to become more informed about child sexual abuse, it really was one of those times when you feel like the curtain's drawn back or the scales are pulled off your eyes, because you start to really see that your background and your experience is not the way the whole world is. So I think today, of course, many, many more of us are really, really aware of not only the pervasiveness of child sexual abuse in our communities and in our in all around us, but also in our churches. Here in Waco, Texas, where I've been executive director for the last 7 years, it just feels like I can't open the paper without seeing that some child molester was caught, some perpetrator was trapped, whatever the stories are. I think all of us know that there's a huge pervasiveness of child sexual abuse in our communities, and the result of that, of course, is that there are lots of adult survivors in our faith communities. So, we know children are at risk, and we know that there are people sitting in our pews all the time on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings and every other time we gather, where child sexual abuse has been some kind of issue. I used to work with colleagues who would tell me that they, as pastors, had never ever encountered anyone in any of their churches who had child sexual abuse as an issue. And I was sort of challenged all the way back in the 80s by Reverend Marie Fortune to start talking about this issue and then see how people respond to it. And of course, my experience was that then I was overwhelmed and flooded with people who wanted to talk about it, because we probably very well, in our silence, send out signals that we're not ready to talk about it. So, most of us are pretty uncomfortable about talking about child sexual abuse. We are more likely to talk about child abuse, and I always tell people when we're talking about this issue that I like doing the training specifically on child sexual abuse, because if we can talk about child sexual abuse, then we probably don't have any problem at all talking about physical abuse or neglect or the wider frame of child abuse. So let's look at the statistics. This statistic is a relatively new statistic, and I think it's really important to look at it. Lifetime experience of 17-year-old girls with sexual abuse and sexual assault was 26.6%. So in other words, 1 in 4, more than 1 in 4, slightly more than 1 in 4 girls in this survey affirmed that they had had some kind of sexual abuse or sexual assault in their life. You'll notice that the statistic for boys is much lower, but I will tell you that many of you who are actual advocates and social workers probably already know that we believe that the reason that the numbers of sexual assaults on boys and sexual abuse is so low is a reporting factor. In our culture in particular, it's very, very difficult for boys to admit to having some kind of sexual abuse or sexual assault. Most of them are unwilling to share that experience or name the experience that way, and so that's not what they would call it. So when we do these surveys, I believe, and many of us believe, this number is way underreported. We also know that a lot of perpetrators, sometimes the sexual assault doesn't have a preference of a girl or a boy. It's about who's available. So, if the perpetrator is a Boy Scout troop leader, he's probably going to be abusing boys. If he manages to be the youth group leader at a church, he may prefer girls. We don't always know why and who gets picked on, but these statistics are pretty striking. For me, in that first experience I had in the 80s where I went and got my first training, because this statistic of a quarter of the girls having experienced some kind of sexual abuse has stayed pretty constant since the 80s. My experience was, when I started to think about that, I started to think about all the kids that came up on a Sunday morning for my children's story, and I sort of counted in my head 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and out of all the kids that were there, I didn't know of almost anyone except maybe one girl who was a foster child who I knew her parents had shared with me had some sort of history of child abuse and neglect, but I thought everybody else was, that this wasn't an issue for my church. And that's why I started talking about these issues, and that's when people started in my congregation talking to me about it. And since that time, I've had folks, whether I'm a lay person in a congregation, whether I'm the pastor, I've had people who obviously know that if I'm willing to talk about, they're willing to talk about what their experience was. And so we know that this is going on in our congregations, and that we have victims, but we also have, in addition to that, we have survivors, people who experienced things many, many years ago sometimes, and sometimes recently, who are still feeling the impact of that. What we do know is that child sexual abuse can have a very long-lasting and a powerful impact. And I always like to tell people that it isn't always that way. It isn't always that someone is completely debilitated. That's not fair to victims, because many, many victims and survivors show high resiliency and are able to get the kind of help they need, often because of some early intervention. And, hopefully they're able to overcome some of the stuff that happened that is the result of child sexual abuse. But what we do know is that child sexual abuse can have can impact in a very important way, both physically and psychologically, the health of the child victim. So one of the things that's interesting is that, of course, this kind of perhaps meets our stereotypes, but we see a big difference in the kinds of behaviors that you see from girl victims and boy victims. And it's not always this way, because quite frankly, I've seen boy victims that are more like what we're describing girl victims. I've seen girl victims who act often like what we're describing boy victims as. But generally speaking, girl victims, they're usually the quiet ones. Sometimes they excel at school. They try to be the perfect little girl, but they suffer from depression. They don't feel like they have a lot of self-esteem. And of course, we often see things like eating disorders as a outcome, an adult outcome, or even a teen outcome of the victimization. Boys tend to exhibit more the external behaviors. They tend to be more acting out. They can get involved with the criminal justice system, violent behavior. There's a lot of stuff that goes on with boys. But like I said, that can happen to children of both sexes. What we do know, though, is that there is a much higher rate of lifetime psychiatric diagnoses with people in general who are victims of child sexual abuse, and that's because there is such a profound impact on the child. And so you can see a little bit more there about some of the stuff that psychiatrists and counselors and mental health professionals would say are often the result of child sexual abuse. Short-term impacts, of course, are the things that we see in kids. We have lots of good webinars from Faith Trust that go into a lot more depth on some of this, but what you see in younger children is often stuff that you see anytime they've had some kind of crisis, sleep disturbances, eating problems, that kind of stuff. But long term, there's huge impact that can come from anxiety, insomnia, and higher rates of sexual re-victimization. So children who have been abused, particularly sexually abused as children, often find themselves being more vulnerable in the future to a lot of other kinds of victimization, meaning that it's not surprising that many more of them are victims of domestic violence, which could be physical and whatnot, but it's also about sexual assault. So unfortunately, all too often that happens. I love this slide because it really gets us to the heart of the matter in terms of why child sexual abuse is so debilitating for some children. And I don't want to make it sound like everybody gets over it. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like everybody's. We need to be clear that not everyone is so permanently damaged that they can't carry on. But there's a huge impact of this kind of abuse, and children who are lucky and get early intervention and are resilient are fortunate to be able to carry on. But I've never met a survivor that didn't tell me that they suffered greatly and that it still impacts their life even into adulthood. And I think this is exactly what happens. We know that abusers actually, we use the term grooming, that they set up a relationship with a child who they know and trust, and they build that dependency on them, so that there's a lot of telling them it's a secret between us, it's a special relationship, it's not out of the ordinary. There's a lot of manipulation that happens. I remember early on people having a fit when I used to have young children, that my kids were allowed to walk to school 3 or 4 blocks, and it was because people would say to me, well, you, Kathy, of all people, should not be letting your kids walk to school. You know how easy it is for children to become victims of abuse. And the statistic that I always knew was this: 93% of victims under the age of 18 know their abuser. It's not a coincidence, because that's what a perpetrator sets up. They set up the system so that they know that child. It's very unlikely and very rare that someone just gets kidnapped on the corner by a total stranger. It's more likely that child sexual abuse is going to take place in the context of being your band instructor or your Boy Scout leader or your coach. Some kind of special relationship where the perpetrators put in that place of being a trusted and known adult who can manipulate the situation to their own benefit. So that betrayal is so important, because that's what undermines the child's self-esteem, and that's what, is the ground bed then for the impact that it has on adult survivors. We just started here at Family Abuse Center a brand new early childhood intervention, and so we have started using much more the ACEs. They're called Adverse Childhood Experiences. ACEs is a really good way of understanding. It's actually an actual, I guess I'd call it, it's a tool that can be used for really helping understand what the impact is on children and predicting what their reaction could be, how they're going to function as adults. It actually looks at these 10 different things that go on in a person's life. I've taken the ACEs tests, and it's a good test for anybody to take, because you can look at whether you have experienced pretty easily any of the 10 types of childhood adversity. Each and every one of these types is something that is directly linked to the onset of chronic disease, mental illness, violence, being a victim of violence. The ACEs studies show that these childhood events make a person more likely to have those kinds of outcomes. And so the more things that have happened to you as it builds up, the more debilitating and more profound the impact is that you find in later life. So a survivor who has had physical abuse, emotional abuse. Thank you, Sarah, for going back, because we kind of need to flip between the two of them. You can see how the childhood experience, you can see what it does. It disrupts their neurological development, their social, emotional, cognitive impairment. It goes all the way up here. And you can see in that pyramid how that can easily result in too much stress for a lifetime, so that down below it is what happened, but up on top is death. And so your whole life, each layer kind of piles up on top of each other in terms of the stress and the impact. If you aren't familiar with ACEs, I think it's really a wonderful thing. You can get tons of information, Googling it, looking online at different things, but it's really a critical way to look at it. And you can see things that we count as kind of normal in the ACEs, like having your parents get divorced, or these things happen. But when you compound that with maybe physical and sexual abuse, plus they're beaten, so they have some physical neglect, they have an incarcerated relative, the more you pile on out of those 10 things, the more profound the result is, and the impact of all of the that trauma. We think of child sexual abuse as trauma. So all of that trauma just kind of piles up, and becomes sort of a good judge on how somebody is functioning, or how impactful the abuse has taken place. So that's kind of a mini lesson on child sexual abuse, and I would encourage you to learn more about that if there's questions you have, not just about child sexual abuse, but physical abuse and emotional abuse. This is what's happening to people who are children in our communities and in our world. And yes, it's very possible that in your congregation, since we're talking specifically about congregations, that you would have children who are going to experience some kind of abuse. It is almost impossible for you to have a congregation where you don't have adult survivors. And so what we really want to focus on today is looking beyond just what sort of happens in child abuse, but what's the role of faith and the church and our faith community, and how can we help instead of hinder positive change and cultural norms, expectations, so that people can thrive and benefit and overcome the trauma that they've experienced as children. On the next slide, we talk a lot, some of the other webinars I've been doing, we've been talking a lot about faith communities in terms of, I like the way we talk about roadblocks or resources. Faith communities are all too commonly roadblocks rather than resources. First and foremost, we have a really hard time talking about sexuality. We have a lot of shame. One of the things that's been really interesting, being a person here that's in Waco, Texas, and hanging out with Baylor University people, my husband teaches at Baylor, is that one of the ways that the women victims of the sexual assaults that took place on campus were made to not report and not get the kind of help that they, everybody says, well, they didn't report this, they didn't go to this person, they didn't go to that person. Well, one of the ways the system failed them is that there's a lot of shame at Baylor University and as a Baptist institution about any kind of premarital sex. There's a lack of ability to talk at all about sexuality, and so also substance abuse. So women victims who did come forward were shamed into being quiet and not saying anything, and that allowed perpetrators then to get away with their rape and abuse without consequences. Patriarchal structures and beliefs. I'm ordained Mennonite minister. The only study that's ever been done on domestic violence and battering that's denominational that I know of was one that was done a long time ago in Winnipeg, Canada, which is a highly concentrated area of Mennonites. And so I can talk about my own denomination without anybody feeling like I'm bashing theirs. But when we did a study on the prevalence of battering, for example, in Mennonite churches, we found that we have a higher than average statistic on that, and which is odd when the public perception of Mennonites is that we're family oriented and that we're close and caring families and communities. Well, we're also patriarchal structures that say that dad is the head of the household, what he says goes, he sets the rules, and therefore if something's happening in a family that shouldn't be happening around child sexual abuse, who do you go to? You can't cross your father. You can't get outside of that patriarchal system. So those kinds of structures and beliefs are certainly one of the roadblocks that you find in faith communities, and certainly I find in my own faith community. Children should be obedient. Adults are to be respected. The first child abuser I ever met was in a psychiatric hospital, who told me that the reason he repeatedly molested his daughters was because he was teaching them to obey their father, honor their father. And it was just hard for me to sit there and listen to him, because he had perverted the text in the scripture that to me is sacred and important, and certainly had twisted it so that it justified his own actions. Yet we have a lot of families where that children should always be obedient, you can't disrespect your elders, goes to the point where we become part of that roadblock, so that children who have been abused can't speak out, don't have a voice, don't have any way to tell someone about what the reality is in their life. And finally here, children should be seen and not heard. The whole idea that somehow children are less than human, maybe they're partly property. You know, we have a long history in this country of seeing children as less than human and thinking of them not as equal to adults. And I don't mean that in a way that says that kids don't need guidance and structure and all that. I'm just saying that all too often we treat children in such a way that it means that they don't feel like they have a voice, and there isn't a way for them to tell about whatever the reality is that they're experiencing in their life. All our faith, whether it's Christian or Muslim or non-denominational, Buddhist, whatever, all of our faith, our different faiths, we share ethical and moral beliefs. I tell people all the time when they say they don't know what to look for example, my husband's an Old Testament scholar, and they'll say, well, what do you look for in Hebrew scriptures about the care of children? And, you know, my husband says the big reoccurring theme constantly that you read throughout the Hebrew scriptures is the care for the widow and the children, the orphans. All of our faiths, regardless of where we come from, have that moral imperative about protecting the vulnerable, and certainly children fall into that category. We also have ideals about justice. We have beliefs that justice should be done, that we need to protect the innocent. And finally, we all believe in some kind of accountability. And accountability becomes difficult when it's in our faith communities and when it's in our churches, but it's something that we're called to live up to, where we need to make the perpetrators accountable in some shape or form to the actions and the deeds and the damage that they've actually done. In of this, of course, the faith leaders and our spiritual leaders, we're the ones that have the moral authority, and we're the ones that speak for the unspoken. So our tradition has lots to say about those. We all have sacred texts that we can quote from. When I was first becoming more aware of these issues, the Reverend Marie Fortune said to me, when you meet a pastor, and maybe I was one of them at the time, who said, there's no one in my congregation who has experienced this, she challenged me to just start speaking the unspoken, talk about all of this. And I made a little promise to myself at that time that when I prayed the prayers of the people, when I spoke, when I preached a sermon, I would use examples of child sexual abuse. I would pray for victims of sexual assault. I would use the tradition and sacred texts of my faith to talk about these issues. And it was like I broke the dam of silence in my congregation, because when I started to speak about these issues, what I discovered is that there were so many adult survivors who longed for someone to speak with, someone who would just listen and believe the stories that they were telling. I heard stories from, I had an 82-year-old woman who came to me and told me that she had never in her life, not even her husband, who had been dead for about 10 years, had she ever told about what happened to her when she was 12 years old in a little town in Iowa, when the doctor did his exam on her when she was 12 years old. And she said to that day, as an 82-year-old, she still woke up with nightmares thinking about her experience, but also knowing that every little girl in that town had the same experience she had. She didn't need a lot of processing from me. She didn't ask for a lot of counseling, but she was relieved to have a faith leader that she could talk to, where we could leave the door open, that we could talk about it in the future, and I could tell her that I was willing to listen and believe what her experience was. It's interesting to me, I've become even more aware in recent weeks, it seems, about how how complicated our relationships are in our faith community, and how really important it is that we understand that it's not just our own individual behavior that affects someone who is a victim, who is going to be a survivor. It's also how we develop communities and what we're willing to tolerate. I haven't met a person yet who doesn't empathize with a parent of a child that's been abused, or doesn't feel badly about a child who has experienced child abuse. The problem is that when the rubber starts hitting the road, as I might say, when we get into an actual experience, it's really important that many of us think about what our ethics are and what we're going to do. Because all too often what we've done is we've stood back and said, well, it's none of our concern. We're not going to get involved. We're worried that there might be a lawsuit. Well, what are we going to do with the perpetrator if he is our friend, or if I need to say that sometimes perpetrators are women, but still statistically, predominantly, perpetrators of child sexual abuse are men. So that's why I'm going to say he. But there are so many times when we don't know how to react because we don't know what to do. Fortunately, child abuse is against the law, and when people use law enforcement, there's a public side to it that I think really helps the faith community start to sort things out in a way that sometimes we have a hard time doing with other kinds of victimization that can happen with adults, where it isn't public. It's considered more a private act. I say that only because I know, for example, right now I'm working with a congregation that's trying to figure out how to manage the fact that they have a staff person who is a batterer, and so they're trying to figure out legally what they can do and what they can't do, and it gets complicated. The thing that we have to, as a faith community, be clear about through all of this is that we cannot be the bystander. We have to be on the side of the victim. We need to be the person that's there to say this shouldn't have happened, it was wrong that it happened, and we need to be the agent, the resources to help people find resiliency and healing and overcome those childhood traumas. Effective policies, this is not the webinar for it, but we have some great webinars from Faith Trust that can really talk about effective policies that faith communities need to have. By that we mean background checks, training for everybody who comes into contact with children. Sadly, all too often we have found the very perpetrators of child sexual abuse within our communities and having even leadership roles. And the best way to protect children, but also to send a clear message that we won't tolerate that kind of behavior, is to have effective policies. And so I'd really encourage you to look at some of the other Faith Trust webinars that really talk about what you need to have in place in your faith community, what kinds of policies will help you. All of those, though, will put you in a better spot so that you're not just a bystander. And I think one of the most important things is for a faith community is to break the silence, because all too often the church has been quiet. Here at Family Abuse Center, each year I ask congregations, any congregation, any faith group, if they would please be willing to do just a simple prayer service or some kind of service of remembrance for domestic violence victims or child abuse victims during either Child Abuse Month or during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, one of those two, that we can partner on. And it's interesting how difficult it is for me to find a congregation that's willing to do that. To me, that is a very simple way for a church to really take a stand and to break the silence, is to make it clear that, make it clear from the pulpit where they stand on these issues. So breaking silence is really kind of a critical thing for our faith communities. One of the things I want to remind you of is that it's so important. I've had people who are survivors of child sexual abuse say, be careful, Kathy, that you don't make it sound like we're all just a bunch of damaged goods. The great news about children, of course, is that they have incredible resiliency. And some of them are in situations where they have trusted adults around them that can really help them overcome and heal from whatever has happened. We talked about protective factors, things that can lessen the impact of that child sexual abuse on the child. I think all of us have known for a long time that the longer the abuse took place, the closer the abuser was in terms of trust and probably familial relationship to the child the abuser was, the longer the silence continued, the more damaging the impact is. In other words, the children who get early intervention and come from stable backgrounds with caring adults who really help them thrive and overcome, find that they have a lot of resiliency and they're really able to move forward. With adult survivors, it's really important. They may not have had those protective factors when they were children. They're still working on a lot of issues, and of course all of this is something that takes a lifetime to overcome. But the protective factors, particularly for us as a faith community, are the three things that you see down here. First and foremost, being believed. When I do trainings where we really do the policies and procedures, and when we talk about what to do when a disclosure is made, we always get into what is a mandated reporting, what do you have to report, how far do you go investigating, all that kind of stuff. The critical thing, particularly with adult survivors, is, and the wonderful thing is that you aren't necessarily reporting anybody to the police. There's absolutely no reason not to listen to somebody and hear and believe what they tell you about what happened to them. And it's important for us to remember that in order for healing to happen, oftentimes survivors have to tell that story over and over again. Now, it's important for us not to prod and poke and make them tell it over and over again. That initiative from them of wanting to tell the story has to come from them. We have to allow them privacy. It's their information. It's their story. They have to tell it. But it's so critical that we listen, and that either overtly or silently, we're constantly saying, I believe you. It's not your fault. You're not alone. We're with you here. I love the part here where it says, listen with an open heart. Don't judge, don't question. Rather, you want to offer support and kindness. And you want to say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. How can I help you now? And it's really important not to prejudge how that help might be needed, but rather to let the survivor lead the way in terms of what is the best for them. What do they think they need? How can they get over and heal from whatever it was that they experienced? I don't say get over lightly. I mean, let them be the guide in terms of their own building resiliency. With children, one of the things we know that builds resiliency is increasing the relationship between the non-offending parent and the child. And I would say that for a community, it's important for us to know that one of the protective factors that we as a community can help children who have been sexually abused is that we can encourage and build systems that enhance the relationship of non-offending, caring adults who are able to listen when it's appropriately and listen with that open heart, and are able to know what to do if there's something that needs to be done. And when you're working with children, there is always the possibility that there is some sort of next step that's going to happen with mandating and reporting, and we need to know what those steps are. And that's the place where our co-workers who are advocates and work in shelters and are other kinds of professionals, counselors, child abuse specialists, those people are able to really give us expert advice as we're trying to figure out how we can help the child the best, because it really does take a whole community to respond appropriately. So the whole point of the training that we're doing here with Faith Trust is we're trying to build not just individuals, but also communities who are really capable of supporting and listening, and resulting in that they're able to create safe places for people. So all too often, of course, survivors get re-victimized. This list is probably not comprehensive, but it's a great list as a beginning point for some of the ways that we re-traumatize people. Creating silence, shame, bringing shame on it. Child abuse victims so often believe, they're told by the perpetrator, it's your fault, you're to blame. And so we have to repeatedly say that you shouldn't be ashamed and it's not your fault. We want to constantly say, I believe you. And we need to find ways to enhance protective factors and promote healing with survivors who are in our congregations and in our communities. One of the things I love about Faith Trust is that they have lots and lots and lots of resources. So this is really not a comprehensive list, but some great stuff that they have available. I will tell you a little bit about some of the things they have. One is that, let me just say that we did an updated edition of my books, the Preventing Child Abuse books for the different age groups. That is specifically Sunday school curriculum for prevention of child sexual abuse. In other words, it's for congregations that want to teach 4 weeks or 13 weeks or have Bible school or something where they are overtly working on child protection. So it involves talking to kids about child sexual abuse. And so when we developed that curriculum, we looked at some of the best of the secular resources, then really looked at Christian-based scriptures and tried to put it together in such a way that it was curriculum for the church. At the time when I started that project, initially many years ago, I was working in a city at that church that I described before, in a city that had pretty progressive child abuse prevention stuff in the school system. And so I was really kind of almost worried about whether it was necessary even to do child abuse prevention in churches. I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but here in Texas, our schools now pretty much only teach what's on the test. And child abuse prevention is not something that's on the test, and so there's very little time to talk about issues of being able to tell a trusted adult about what's happening to you, or what's going to happen if you know somebody who's been abused, and what should happen, let alone take the extra steps of talking about some of the really important topics that build resiliency. One of the impacts that the Preventing Child Abuse curriculum has is that if you can talk to young children about some of the more difficult issues, forgiveness, and that blaming and the shame, you can talk to them in such a way that, you know, you can't protect every child from this happening, but you can start to plant the seeds for them to understand the context of what happens around them in a really positive way that enhances their ability to be resilient and overcome the damage that's done to them by being abused. So I think there's a lot of positive impact from considering doing the sexual abuse curriculum in a church setting that goes beyond just what's done in school. We have some excellent resources in terms of recent articles and things that are available that I think are the kinds of things that will go into a lot of different questions that you might have. Particularly in particular, you can see some stuff there about ACEs, about the resources around the actual looking more in depth at those kinds of adverse childhood experiences and the impact of them. I like the stuff on resiliency because it really helps us understand better how we can build resiliency in children even when we're not sure what the trauma was. We just know what the trauma was about. And I love thinking about ministry as being trauma-informed. Most domestic violence shelters and most child abuse services are now calling themselves using the trauma-informed kind of model. That's a real common model for us. Well, what does that mean for a congregation? How can we use some trauma-informed care in terms of understanding the kinds of trauma that children undergo, and then the results of that trauma as they're adult victims? I would love to take some questions if you have questions. Can't believe that I have covered everything, but I'm hoping that this gives you little insight into what faith communities can do in addressing this huge problem.
Hi, Kathy. This is Sarah. I just want to point out a couple of other things on the resource list. One, this article, What's Their Problem Sharing Our Pews with Sexual Assault Victims and Survivors, is excellent. And I think it gives a survivor's viewpoint of what it looks like to be in the pew and not be recognized as there. So, and also we created a resource, a discussion guide on Spotlight the movie, which won the Oscar this year, and it's about clergy child sexual abuse. And we have resources there for Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities to talk about these issues using the film as a way to open up the discussion. So that's free on our website. I recommend people take a look at that. And let's see, we have a couple of questions. Do you know of good basic resources to have on hand for adult survivors?
Boy, Sarah might be able to answer that better than I can. I mean, I have kept a series of books on my shelf. Mostly they're books that I lend out, you know, that I have used over the years. Courage to Heal would be an example. I mean, there's a lot of secular stuff. There's less religious stuff. Quite frankly, if it doesn't come from Faith Trust, I'm not sure about it, because they really are the premier people who work on the religious side of all of these issues. Sarah, do you have some great resources that you would recommend?
You know, I will have to put some thought into that. I know one thing that we have for parents is the Mother's Book, How to Survive the Molestation of Your Child, which is a really great resource for parents who have recently or have discovered that their children were molested or abused. So one of the things I would ask you, Kathy, is what can the faith community do to assist the family, the non-offending family members or people in the child's life?
Well, I often tell groups of people about one of the models that I've seen that I just still think was an amazing thing. I had a colleague in another city who had some child sexual abuse within the congregation. Sadly, it was their youth group leader, and he molested several young girls in that congregation. And one of the things that I thought that congregation did so well, that I often just describe, is they formed what they called care groups around each and every person in their congregation who was touched by the abuse that took place. I mean, obviously you have to have some consent from the family and a willingness to do it, but meaning that they formed a care group for the non-offending parent, so that she had some support as she tried to figure out what her life was going to look like. In this case, her husband went to prison for the abuse. What her life was going to be like, what the issues were going to be going forward in terms of whether she was going to stand by him and help him in his defense, or whether she was going to divorce him and leave. They had care groups around each of the young girls that had been molested. They had care groups around each of their sets of parents. In this case, there were multiple victims. I thought that congregation did one of the best jobs I've ever seen of really providing support. I mean, it took a lot of courage for this fairly small church to talk about what happened and explain what happened, and then make a real commitment to being there for the victims, their parents, and the people who are, it's like a ripple effect. There's so many people on the outside who are impacted beyond just the child victim themselves. But this congregation thought it through really, really well. And you may be thinking in the back of your head, well, what did they do with the perpetrator? They actually had a care group for the perpetrator, too. That fell apart pretty fast because he didn't want any accountability. He didn't want the care. He wanted everything to kind of be forgotten, forgiven, and over pretty quickly. And so he was reluctant to carry on with that care group, but their intention in the beginning was to even include him in that care group, knowing that they were going to have some accountability in the end if he stayed in the congregation. That, for me, has been one of the best examples I've seen of a faith community that really took the situation head on, was honest and open about it. Really, it would have never gotten to the police if there weren't people in that congregation who from the very beginning believed the young children who were victimized. They just did a great job of standing with the victims, and I think it's a good model that can even work in larger congregations. So it's one of the things that I always suggest to faith communities. I think with adults, there's a lot of things that we can do. When we talk about breaking that silence and just letting people know that we are willing to talk about the issue, we here in Waco decided we wanted to run some support groups. We've run support groups for victims. We've run support groups for family members of victims. And we don't necessarily want to do those at the shelter. There's no reason to come to the shelter for them. I've always had to go begging to congregations to get them to use our facility. Boy, what a great thing it would be if a faith community would come to me and say, Kathy, we'd like to have a support group in our church. What a wonderful thing to have adult victims be able to come to some kind of, survivors to come to some kind of support group in a congregational setting. It would open up the conversation. It would let victims, a lot of times, there are many times when there's going to be survivors in a congregation who are never going to say anything. So nobody's going to really know that they're survivors. But those kinds of subtle messages, even just seeing in your church newsletter or your faith community's bulletin or some mechanism that there are actually support groups going on for people who have experienced what you experience, even if you don't attend, it's a really powerful message of believing and support. And so those kinds of activities have an impact way beyond what we imagine they might have.
Thanks, Kathy. So we have a question about what would be the best approach to reach out to religious institutions and organizations to work with them about educating their community on abuse.
Well, one of the things that's been helpful for me as a pastor, I've really tried to reach out to the religious community. And I have to tell you that I have been sometimes successful and sometimes I've been a total failure. When I came to this job 7 years ago, and of course, Waco is a small community, but a very religious community. We have 129 Baptist churches. Can you imagine? I asked one of the pastors who was really in a very supportive role at the shelter, I told him I would like to just introduce myself to I think I asked him for the list of what he thought the 10 most influential pastors were in the city of Waco. And so I started calling pastors, and I called, and, I'd get the church secretary, not the pastor, and I'd make it clear that I wasn't trying to raise money, and I'm not even recruiting volunteers. I just want to introduce myself and talk about this issue and kind of thing. And I think I was just terribly disappointed when in the end, out of the initial list of 10, I think I only got 2 appointments with 2 pastors. The others, I never got past the secretary, even after repeated calls. I think that a lot of times when you're reaching out to faith communities, unfortunately, you have to be a little fly under the radar, a little subversive. One of the things I found really helpful is to talk to the pastors' wives. pastors' wives, faith leaders' spouses in general, whether they're male or female, have a lot of impact. And quite frankly, if the spouse is a female person, she's probably more interested in this topic. The other thing is that there are often lay people who are in important positions in faith communities who are going to be receptive to talking more about child abuse and domestic violence and sexual assault, all of these issues. You know, when I first started this work in the 80s, we thought if you beat your wife, you didn't molest your children. If you molested your children, you probably didn't beat your wife. We know that's not true. We know that all of these issues kind of cluster, and that families that have a lot of child abuse can also have battering and a lot of violence in a lot of other ways. The violence sort of permeates the entire system. And so, you know, our reluctance to talk about any one of those topics makes it difficult for us to talk about any of them. So, you know, I look in faith communities for kind of inroads. You know, maybe it's not even a person in an official position of power. Maybe it's the matriarch of the church. You know, I'm happy when I get invited to the Women's Day or the missionary thing. I take every opportunity to sort of get my foot in the door, because ultimately I know that if a congregation is going to really take on this topic, the pastors and the power structure of the congregation are going to have to really invest some significant time in talking about how they want to deal with these topics and how they want to be open to it. So it's no surprise that I find women clergy much more receptive than a lot of male clergy. But I'm open to trying everything to reach out to the community. And there's so much that faith communities can do in partnership. I'll tell you, I would love it if a pastor of a church would call me up and say, Kathy, I'm the pastor of so-and-so. I just want to know more about Family Abuse Center. I'd like to know what services you provide. Can I take you to lunch? I would love if invitations came from the faith community. I mean, we're fortunate here at Family Abuse Center that we're able to give people tours. We're able to do classes over at the seminary about these issues. All of those are opportunities for us to get out in the community, and we take as many of them as we can get, because not only do I want faith communities to be resilient resources for survivors, I also want faith communities to be helpful in the support services that victims and survivors need as they grow, and as they, in my case here at Family Abuse Center, most of our adult victims, you know, are starting over and they need jobs, they need places to live, they need faith communities to become part of. There's so much they need, and there's so much of what they need that the faith community can help provide. That partnership between service providers and the faith community is a rich one that I think both sides of it, we need to mine that relationship. We need to really enrich it, and I think it will benefit the survivors in our midst if we can provide that kind of resource.
Thanks, Kathy. So I just want to let everyone know that I will update the PowerPoint presentation with links to a couple of previous webinars that we've done. One is about sex offenders in the congregation and what does the church do or the faith community do when that happens. The other is a webinar that Kathy did a couple of years ago on developing community networks and relationships. Kathy, I have a quick question. We're getting to the end of the time, but I wonder if going because the church sexual abuse scandal, the Catholic Church scandal, was so huge, and so many denominations have now created policies, I wonder if going to the folks who are in charge of church policies and introducing yourself to those people is a way to make connections with congregations.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a way to go to congregations. That's a great idea, Sarah, because, you know, I look for every little place I can get my toe in the door, meaning that it may be a person who doesn't understand child abuse at all, but they're concerned about insurance and litigation. Well, that might be a place to start talking about some of these issues. So you're absolutely right. People who are in charge of policies, even people who are the ones that sort of oversee, you know, the kinds of general things that the congregation's doing, those are great places to start these conversations. And, you know, if you can find a person in a congregation, you can build on that relationship. And that's really helpful. And, you know, the shoe's on the other foot, too. If you're in a church and you want, you know, you want to really make it clear that your congregation stands with survivors, you know, if for some reason when you call the local service provider you don't get the response you were hoping for, keep at it. You know, maybe you're going to have a social worker who works at the works somewhere, who's going to be in your congregation, is going to open up the door to a relationship that previously wasn't there. You know, it takes all of us together to really respond and to provide the resources. We can really build that resiliency and provide healing and hope for survivors.
Yeah, and let's not forget all the social workers and advocates who are actually part of our faith communities.
Absolutely.
And
great resource.
They need our supporters. Yeah, exactly. So Kathy, thank you so much for today's presentation. I don't want to keep us much longer, but I will let you know that we are having our Meaningful Voices book club on July 20th, and we're talking about The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. So I hope you will join us for that. It's a free online book club. And as you're closing out today, if you would just take a few minutes to fill out the survey, we would be most appreciative. Give us your thoughts about this webinar, suggestions for other webinars, and I will be emailing you later this afternoon with the PowerPoint presentation, the list of resources, and please let me know if we can help you in any other way. So this concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.